Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Bible. We're starting a podcast and we also have interviews. And so I just want to welcome you today and I want to introduce you to our special guest. And so we have Natasha Smith today, and she's written an incredible book on Will You Just Sit With Me? And she has gone through a lot of loss and trusted the Lord in all of that, and I'm looking forward to hearing her share her heart and how she's going to encourage us today. So welcome, Natasha.
Hi, Jenny. Thank you so much for having me. Again, I'm just excited to be sitting with you today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm encouraged by that too. Yeah, and we just think this is such a great fit with her Bible as women listen to the Word and let the Word wash over them. It's an audio Bible in women's voices, and we've had incredible stories of women experiencing healing and connection with the Lord through listening. And so I love what you're saying about listening too. And I was wondering if you could just start with your story and a little bit about your walk with the Lord and then some of the struggles you've had to face.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, so my story, it really starts with me sitting with grief for over 30 years. And when I say sitting with grief, it's my lost story kind of starts in my teen years, from teen pregnancy, miscarriage, and then placing a child my senior year in high school into adoptive care. From there, the death of my sister when I was a sophomore in college, to that was my oldest sister. Then my next oldest sister died as well, and my dad, and then the murder of my nephew. So the list is like, it goes on and on and on and can feel never ending. So that's part of my lost story. I also say that I suffered living losses. So those losses that are not necessarily, they're not the death of a person, but they still hold just as much weight. So the loss of career, loss of identity, those sort of things. So I sat with a lot of that grief because I didn't know how to process it. I didn't know where to go. And so I stuffed it, hid it, tried to ignore it the best I could with busyness. But thankfully, kind of talking about my faith story and how, I come to know the Lord. And I came to know him in high school, my sophomore year of high school. And it's like, I grew up in a Christian home, and so I knew about the Lord. I knew about Christ. But I came to know him personally in my sophomore year of high school. And I know for a fact that it has to have been my saving grace because, we serve a God who is all-knowing. He is the Alpha and Omega, and he knew what my story would be. He knows how all of our stories will unfold, like page after page. And so he knew how much I would really need him in my life. So when I say I sat with grief and it felt like I couldn't talk to anyone because a lot of people in my peer group hadn't experienced any loss. So, my sister died, I'm experiencing all these other things and no one else is. And so I didn't feel like I could connect with anyone or have a safe place. But God was my safe place. Jesus was my safe place. So,
I love that.
Yeah.
How would you describe or share a story of a time when Jesus was a safe place for you?
I have so many stories. I'm trying to choose one. It's like time after time after time. But I could say, I can just take, for instance, the loss of my oldest sister, Angie, when I was in college. Because with her story, she had been diagnosed with cancer. She was only 32. I was like 19 at the time.
So young, yeah.
So young. And she had made a decision with my family that they wouldn't tell me because I was away at school. And so that was a whole nother level of grief. And so I was so angry. So it was the grief paired with anger toward my family. And so God was my safe place to let out the anger. Because, I often thought like, I couldn't come to God with my anger. Like he doesn't want, those type of emotions, And so it was a time when I kind of grew into, no, I can bring everything to him. He is my safe place. He is my safe place. And I love to say that, grief needs a place to go, whether it's on the page or it's to a safe person. And sometimes people are like, I don't have a safe person, but Jesus can always be our safe person.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And how did he meet you when you were expressing that frustration and anger over how your family kept that from you, for example, and you didn't get to say goodbye?
Yeah. In that piece that, sometimes we hear biblical things and they can come off and sound Christianese, but in my case, it literally was a peace that surpasses all understanding. I will say, like, that caveat to that is that it did not come overnight, but it did come with a pressing into him, meaning coming to him in prayer, coming to him in what I now know as lament. Because back then, I'm a teenager. I don't know what lament is. No one ever taught me what lament was. But now I know what I was doing then was lament. Like, I was coming to him, Lord, I'm mad, I'm angry, I'm hurt. This feels crappy. Like, I don't like how this feels. And I did have some Christian community around me because there was a fellowship on campus that I had plugged into. And so I did have people surrounding me that kind of encouraged me to forgive kind of walking me through that forgiveness, because it was more for me. Like, I needed that forgiveness for me to help in that healing process. And so walking through that was also helpful as well. Yeah.
I was thinking about a 32-year-old me and how I tried to be strong. And so I could see me saying that to my sister, trying to appear strong and not realizing what it would cost her later on.
Yeah, I mean, I totally get it. When I turned 32, it was interesting to kind of think back, like, okay, yeah, I get it. And I totally understand why she would have said that or done that. But the 19-year-old me didn't understand.
Yes, yeah. I was wondering, Natasha, if you could share any particular passages or verses that have been meaningful to you, or your favorite Bible character, that an example that has really ministered deeply to your soul.
So I have several of those as well. So I have two Psalms that have been on total repeat, meaning I am meditating on these things every single day for the last 2 months. But that's Psalms 23. I know it's so familiar, but it's been so washing over me, and I've been needing that. And Psalm 91. Of course, they're really familiar, but oh my gosh, they have been so anchoring, like right now. But in the past, and some that I still rehearse and go over is, I want to say it's Psalm 46 and 5. It's probably 42 and 5. But it says, when my soul was in the dumps, and this is the Message version, when my soul was in the dump, I remember everything I know of you. And it's just a reminder to me to not get spiritual amnesia when my heart is hurting and when I'm filled with so much grief and pain, to not forget who God is and who he's always been and who he wants to be in our lives, and how he wants to sit with us. He wants to be invited into our pain and our suffering and our hurt. And it just reminds me to not forget who he is. Even though I'm hurting, he is still the same. He has not changed, and he wants to comfort us and be our healer. Just everything he is. He wants us to remember that when we're hurting and grieving.
Yeah, I love that you brought up Psalm 23, even though, again, it's such a familiar passage. The Lord has ministered to me so deeply through that psalm. And just a little bit of my story, my dad was constantly yelling, criticizing us, and I was the oldest child, and a lot of it was at the dinner table. And so that psalm, with he sets the table for you in the presence of your enemies. And I just had so many painful memories around the dinner table, which should have been a time of loving fellowship. And so the Lord has really ministered to me through that, realizing that he was there, he saw everything that happened, and that he sets the table for me. And again, getting back to what you're saying about sitting with us, desiring to sit with us.
Oh, I love that so much.
I'm glad. So, and then a Bible character.
Bible character,
Man or woman.
Yes, it has to be. You would think it's Job, which Job, he is a heavy hitter when it comes to grief. But I found Naomi's story
Oh, yes.
to resonate and just be so rich that, because before like trying to find out what the Bible really says about grief, I didn't know all this, how much it was threaded through and through with
Mm-hmm.
grief and pain and suffering and how people dealt with it. And so when I came across Naomi's story, because, a lot of times it's Ruth and
Mm-hmm.
Boaz.
Yes, yes.
And so Naomi's story, just with her loss, how she dealt with the loss of people, husband and sons, but then the loss of property, possessions,
Mm-hmm.
loss of a move, from Bethlehem to
Mm-hmm.
Moab. So it really, really resonates with me
Mm-hmm.
as it relates to grief. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, and even when she returned,
Yeah.
she wanted to be called Mara for
Yeah.
bitter. And here she lost her whole community, and then she's
Mm-hmm.
coming back in poverty. Yeah, I really resonate with what you're saying. I remember Naomi said she came back empty-handed,
Mm.
but she had Ruth with her. So she was,
Yeah.
poor Ruth was being, overlooked in that conversation.
Yeah. Oh, goodness.
Anything else from the life of Naomi that encourages you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, her story is kind of like one of those stories that, like, it doesn't end in ashes, so to speak. The Lord redeems her by giving them or sending her a kinsman redeemer. Is that how it's? I think that's the name of
Kinsman
it.
Redeemer, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so her story ends in a way that the Lord did kind of redeem her. Her life and her story was redeemed. And it just kind of takes me back to kind of what I mentioned kind of before with my own story or with all of our stories, really. God knows. He knows how the story will end. We have to just kind of allow Him to walk alongside with us, order our steps. Lord, help me to walk in the steps that you've already ordered for me. He knows. And so it's like putting that trust in Him that
Mm-hmm.
He knows the end. And I keep having to tell myself, He knows the end. And it's a good end, Jeremiah 29:11. He knows the plans that He has for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the end and the future that we have no
Yeah.
idea of.
Yeah.
And all they were doing was taking care of this little boy that they were
I
blessed with.
know, right? That's so true. Oh my
Mm-hmm.
goodness. I love that.
I have 4 sons.
Okay. Oh.
I wanted to go back to the concept in your book of sitting with me and talk about how do we encourage or come alongside our friends who are going through grief.
Yeah. One thing that I've learned just personally and then actually coming alongside with others is that the presence is so underrated. And so we hear a lot about the ministry of presence. And sometimes it's like, what does that look like? How do we put that into action? And it literally is listening. Like we listen, if we have that, think about that ratio, the listening to talking, we should be listening more than we're talking because most often what I've experienced and what I've heard is like, someone is trying to tell their story. They're trying to tell what is happening to them, but most often someone interjects with their own story. And so then they become the hurting, the griever becomes the listener.
Oh.
Instead of the person that is talking. And so oftentimes that can hinder the griever from wanting to share again and even cause them to isolate. And so it's having that listening ear. And even when we want to kind of encourage them, which we can, not to give, I don't want to say unwanted advice, but, not to judge. So those things when we are sitting with others, it's like having a listening ear without judgment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful. And that requires self-awareness.
It does. And what I'm finding, it's not a school, right? We don't go to school and really learn like how to sit, like really sit and be intentional listeners towards someone's need. Because most often we listen with our head and not our heart. And so,
How can we
I feel
listen
like
better with our heart?
Right. I think it's wanting, like, if we want to be supportive of those who are hurting, those who are grieving, I would say even starting with prayer. Lord, give me ears to hear the hearts of others. Help me to really see and sense people the way that you do. Because I feel like a lot of times we do so many things in our own strength, me included, but we need God's strength to help us in helping and serving others. And so that's what I feel and sense that is where we're probably lacking in our support of grievers, is that we really, in our own strength, we're like innately selfish people.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need
Yes.
God's help and God's eyes and more of his heart to want to sit and really want to know what is on the heart of someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you just think about, going to church or work or wherever, and you're passing by people and you're like, hey, how you doing? It's like, do you really want to know? You know what I mean? Because,
Yes.
you're used to like, oh, I'm good, fine. And, but if someone stops you, are you really prepared? And so, yeah, it's like having that, put it on Christ, put in more, put in on more of him and his nature, to want to really know what is on the heart of others and to want to point them to him, and how we relate to them.
Yeah, that reminds me of a team prayer time we had this morning, and we were looking at Mark chapter 6 when Jesus had just fed the 5,000, and he had the disciples get in a boat, and then he came along walking on water, and they were all scared. And it says, I never noticed this before, that he was going to pass them by. And they thought it was a ghost, but then he reassured them, and that was an interesting concept, that he's walking around and passing by. And then the last line of the story really is, they didn't understand the feeding of the 5,000 because their hearts were hard. And I think the busyness of life, and we were talking about maybe focused on our own strength or our own agenda, and then we miss people. We miss God in our daily life.
I love how you brought that up.
Thank you.
That was good.
I've asked a few questions, but I wanted to know, is there anything that you'd like to share that I haven't asked from your book? Or
Yeah. So, Can You Just Sit With Me is a book that is for those who are grieving, but also for those who really want to come alongside those who are grieving. And one thing that I love about it is that it does contain like relevant research. I'm kind of like a research junkie in the best way, from a standpoint of kind of helping us to understand ourselves, like building that self-awareness, kind of what we were talking about, like we need to be more self-aware of some things. And so building that self-awareness, I feel like, has been so important in my journey. And so it contains that, but then it does contain the personal stories to say, okay, this happened to her, that it happened to me, like I'm not alone. So it's that connection to say, you're not the only one. Because a lot of times when we're walking through grief, it feels like this is like, Lord, why is all this, but we're not the only one. So it has that element, and then the biblical aspect. That, to me, for this particular book, is so golden because, again, I did not know how much the Bible is threaded with grief and loss and suffering and pain. That was from my church background growing up, and that may be the story for those who are listening. Maybe they didn't know how much the Bible talks about grief, and really learning like, okay, so Jesus wept was the first Bible verse that I learned as a child.
yeah.
And no, I did not know the full concept and the full weight of these two words. But now, knowing how much more it gives us as believers, as Christians, Christ followers, the permission to grieve.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this book is helpful in that vein for the believer, for Christians to say, yes, it's okay to grieve. It's okay to have questions. It's okay to make space for grief. And these are kind of the things that I talk about in the book when we look at the life of Jesus and using Jesus as our example. It's like I use the illustration of like the little slap bracelets or the bracelets back in the day where WWJD, what would Jesus do? Yeah. So in grief, what would Jesus do? And looked at his life, and he made space for grief. We can take this story when he learned of John the Baptist, his cousin's death, and he went away to a quiet place and he prayed. We know that in the garden he prayed
Mhm.
He prayed when he felt such a deep grief and just the weight of his assignment. And we know that he had questions in the garden. Even on the cross,
Mhm.
he had
Mhm.
questions. And so, looking at Jesus' life, it just makes so much space for us to grieve just in following his life and expressing emotions, of course, just going back to the Jesus wept. So I just feel like it's filled with so much of God's goodness and just his revelation on how we can grieve in healthy ways.
Yeah, thank you. I love that application.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much, Natasha, for joining me today and for sharing with our listeners the rich things that God has built into your life through suffering. And I just really appreciate you sharing deeply with us and through your book, and just pray that God continues to bless you in that, people's hearts are encouraged to grieve and to, draw closer to the Lord as a
Yeah.
result, even in really hard things.
Yes.
So,
I agree so much. So thank you so much for having me in this time and just for chatting with me.
yes, you're so welcome. It's been an honor to meet you, Natasha.
Oh, same here. Thank you.
So, thank you everyone for joining us, and just pray that this encourages you to trust God more as you listen to Natasha's story.